Craven House was plunged into the silence of the night. Beyond the tall windows, stars twinkled above Grosvenor Square, and inside, only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway disturbed the peace. The servants had long since retired to their rooms on the upper floors. The candles in the candlesticks had been blown out. Only in the master's chambers did a faint light still glow. Lord Arthur Craven stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the deserted street below. Sleep had eluded him for hours. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the fatigue that had accumulated over the past few months. 2 years had passed since Elizabeth's death, yet the mansion remained cloaked in the same silence that had engulfed it on the day of the funeral. Arthur had no desire to change anything in the house. Everything remained in its place, as if his wife had simply gone to visit her relatives and would soon return. But she would not return. This thought burned more sharply than it should have after so much time had passed. Arthur threw a dark blue velvet robe over his nightshirt and went out into the hallway. His feet carried him down to the library, the only place where he could find any semblance of peace. The marble steps of the staircase were cold, even through the soles of his slippers, and the shadows from his candle danced across the dark green silk walls. He pushed open the carved library door, expecting to see the usual darkness, and froze. In the far corner of the room by the window, a candle burned. In the front of it, bent over an open book, sat a figure in a simple gray dress. Arthur recognized her immediately. Grace Milner, one of the maids who always kept herself slightly apart from the other servants, whose back was too straight and whose gaze was too direct when answering the housekeeper's questions. He watched her for a few moments, giving no sign of his presence. Grace was sitting with her back to the door, and the candlelight fell softly on her face, accentuating the straight line of her nose and the curve of her neck. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple bun. Her fingers moved slowly across the page, touching it with the caution one would use with something precious. Her dress was simple, gray muslin with long sleeves and a modest neckline. The starched white collar and cuffs revealed her to be a person accustomed to order. But that wasn't the main thing. What was important was that she was reading in his library in the middle of the night. "Miss Milner," Arthur said, stepping into the room. Grace started and turned abruptly. The book slipped from her hands, and she hurriedly got up, dropping her white handkerchief on the floor. Her face turned pale. "My lord, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were here." His voice sounded sharper than he had intended. Curiosity mingled with irritation. Servants were not permitted in the library, especially at night. Grace lowered her gaze, her fingers clenching the folds of her skirt. It was a gesture that did not escape Arthur's attention. "I was cleaning up this afternoon, and I noticed that one of the books was misplaced," she faltered, searching for words. "I wanted to put it back. I couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, my lord." Arthur slowly walked over to the table where the open book lay. He recognized it. It was a volume from Father Annalita's collection of Tacitus in Latin. It was a heavy folio in a worn leather binding that few had opened in recent years. He looked up at Grace. She stood with her eyes downcast, but her tense shoulders suggested that she was preparing for a blow. "Do you read Latin, Miss Milner?" The pause dragged on. The ticking of the mantelpiece clock seemed unbearably loud. "A little, my lord," she replied quietly at last. "My father was a teacher. He taught me when I was a child." Arthur narrowed his eyes. The explanation sounded plausible, but something about it felt wrong. Not the words themselves, but the way she said them. Too carefully, too deliberately. "A teacher," he repeated. "And where is your father now?" "He died, my lord, many years ago." "My condolences." Grace nodded slightly. She still wasn't looking at him, and he was starting to find this annoying. It wasn't because she was being rude. It was because he wanted to see her eyes and understand what was hidden behind her outward submission. "How long have you been working in my house?" he asked, even though he knew the answer perfectly well. Grace had been hired 8 months ago, recommended by the housekeeper who had hired her after the previous maid got married. "All these months, my lord, and you often go to the library at night." Now she looked up, and Arthur involuntarily held his breath. Her eyes were gray, almost silver in the candlelight, and they revealed something more than just fear of punishment, defiance or despair. "No, my lord, this is the first time." "The first," he smiled. "And you expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing, my lord," she replied evenly. I only ask forgiveness for the intrusion. It will not happen again." Arthur walked around the table and approached her. Grace took an instinctive step back, her back pressing against the bookcase. He stopped 2 steps away from her and studied her face. Her features were delicate, almost aristocratic. She had high cheekbones and a graceful jawline. Her lips were now pressed tightly together. Her skin was pale and showed no signs of hard work, despite the fact that she cleaned and served at the table. And her posture, the way she carried herself. "You don't look like an ordinary maid, Miss Milner," he said quietly. Something fluttered in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or something else. "I am an ordinary maid, my lord." "Ordinary maids don't read Tacitus." "Then perhaps I am not entirely ordinary." There was a barely perceptible note of sarcasm in her voice, which she immediately tried to hide. "But that doesn't change who I am." Arthur felt his curiosity flare up. This woman was a mystery. He had long noticed certain oddities, how she would sometimes correct the housekeeper on minor details of the table setting for formal dinners, how she held her back as they walked through the rooms, and how she spoke without the usual Cockney accent or rural dialect of the servants. He also remembered the incident 3 weeks ago when his aunt, Lady Margaret, came for tea and Grace served dessert. His aunt dropped her fan, and Grace picked it up with a curtsy that would have been appropriate at court, but not in the home of an ordinary lord. His aunt then looked Grace up and down, but said nothing. Arthur remembered. "Who are you really, P?" he asked bluntly. Grace sighed, and there was so much weariness in that sigh that Arthur softened involuntarily. "Grace Milner, my lord. I am a maid. I have nothing more to say." "So you prefer to keep quiet about your past?" "Everyone has things they prefer not to talk about," she replied, and something like understanding flashed in her eyes. Even when it came to lords, hinting at his own secrets, those sleepless nights and locked doors in the east wing of the house where Elizabeth once lived, made Arthur back down. "You are bold for a servant," he remarked, but without his former harshness. "I'm sorry, my lord, that was not my intention." He wanted to say something else, but at that moment, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Both of them froze, listening. Then footsteps sounded. Someone was coming down the stairs. It was either the housekeeper or the butler. Arthur quickly assessed the situation. If Grace were found here with him in the middle of the night, her reputation would be ruined, even among the servants. He himself didn't care, but the thought of this woman being discussed behind his back annoyed him for some reason. "Go," he ordered, lowering his voice. "Go through the side door to the garden. No one will see you." Grace hesitated for a moment, then grabbed her candle and hurried toward the small door in the corner of the library that led to the winter garden. She turned at the threshold, and their eyes met. It was a long, tense moment, full of unspoken questions. Then she disappeared through the door, and Arthur was left alone. He walked over to the table and picked up Tacitus's Annals. The book was open to the chapter about the senator's conspiracy against the emperor. An interesting choice of reading material for a maid. He ran his fingers over the page where she had been writing just minutes before. A thin note had been made in pencil in the margin. Just a few words in Latin. Veritas filia temporis. Truth, daughter of time. Whose handwriting was it? It wasn't his or his father's, so it must be Grace's. But why would a maid make notes in the Lord's books? Footsteps approached the library door, and Mr. Johnson, the butler, appeared in the doorway. The elderly man with receding temples and an impenetrable expression stopped when he saw his master. "My lord, I heard footsteps and decided to check if you were all right." "Yes, Johnson, I just couldn't sleep. I decided to reread something." The butler glanced around the room at the open book and the 2 candles, one of which had clearly just been extinguished in the garden. He noticed, but said nothing. "May I bring you some brandy, my lord?" "No, thank you. I'll be up soon." The butler bowed and withdrew, closing the door behind him. Arthur looked at the open book again. Veritas temporis filia. What secret had Grace Milner kept? And why did he so desperately want to know? Grace made her way to her small attic room, barely able to stand. Her heart was pounding so hard that it felt as though it might jump out of her chest. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it, and closed her eyes. It was foolish. It was incredibly foolish to go to the library, but she couldn't resist. The books, the smell of old leather and paper, the Latin text she once knew by heart, all of it drew her in like a magnet. In this house, she could return, if only for a moment, to the life she had lost. But now Lord Craven knew, not everything, of course, but enough to start asking questions. Questions? They were dangerous. Very dangerous. She walked over to the narrow window overlooking the rooftops of London. The stars twinkled above the city, indifferent to human troubles and secrets. Somewhere out there in another part of the city stood the mansion where she had been born, a mansion that now belonged to others, a place she could never return to. Grace ran her hand over her nose, wiping away uninvited tears. No, she had made a vow. It was a vow that she would not break, no matter what it cost her. Even if it meant looking Lord Craven in the eye and lying to him every day for the rest of her life. Fully clothed, she lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. The Lord's stern face with its sharp features and dark eyes that revealed too much loomed before her eyes. He was perceptive, dangerously so. If he starts digging deeper, he won't find out, she told herself. No one will find out. I've covered my tracks too carefully. But even as she repeated these words, Grace felt that something had changed that night. Something had started to shift, like the first stone of an avalanche. And it was already impossible to stop it. The morning at Craven House began as usual. The servants rose at dawn, and soon the sounds of the house coming to life carried through the mansion. There were quiet footsteps in the corridors, muffled voices in the kitchen, and the rustling of bodies. Sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains in the dining room, where breakfast had been laid for the master of the house. Arthur came downstairs at 8:30, as usual. He had spent a sleepless night replaying yesterday's meeting in his head, and now felt exhausted. But curiosity would not let him rest. At breakfast, he barely touched his eggs and toast, mechanically leafing through the morning paper without taking in any of the words. Veritas temporis filia. The phrase wouldn't leave his mind. Truth is the daughter of time. What did it mean to Grace? Was it a warning or a reminder to herself? My lord. The voice of Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, brought him out of his thoughts. A plump, middle-aged woman with a jingling set of keys on her belt stood in the doorway of the dining room. May I ask if everything is all right this morning? The maid said you hardly touched your food. Everything is fine, Mrs. Harris. I'm just not very hungry. The housekeeper nodded, but her gaze remained attentive. She had worked for this family since the time of the late Lord Arthur's father and knew them well enough to notice changes in her master's mood. My lord, if you'll allow me, I'd like to talk to you about household matters. We need to decide on new curtains for the drawing room. Arthur listened to her half-heartedly, nodding at the right moments, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Where was Grace now? What was she doing? Would she avoid him after yesterday? As if in answer to his thoughts, the dining room door opened slightly, and a familiar figure in a dark blue cotton dress and white apron appeared. Grace was carrying a tray with a tea set on it, clearly there to collect the dirty dishes. She entered quietly, almost silently, her eyes downcast. Morning light from the window fell on her face, and Arthur noticed the slight shadows under her eyes. She hadn't slept well either. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Only one dark strand had escaped from under her white cap. Her movements were quick and confident. She collected the plates and stacked the cutlery, but never once looked up at him. My lord, are you listening? Mrs. Harris raised her voice slightly. Yes, of course, the curtains. Order whatever you think is necessary. The housekeeper frowned but said nothing. She turned to Grace. Milner, don't forget to clean the silver in the large living room afterwards, and make sure that the flower vases are in order. Lady Margaret is coming this afternoon. Yes, Mrs. Harris. Grace's voice was quiet but steady. She picked up the tray and headed for the door. Just then one of the spoons slipped off the edge and fell to the floor with a soft clink. Grace froze, then quickly bent down to pick it up. But Arthur was quicker. He rose from the table, stepped towards her, and lifted the spoon. Their fingers almost touched as he held out the silver object to her. Grace finally looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Her gray eyes were full of anxiety, but there was something else in them too, a defiance that she was trying to hide behind her submissiveness. Thank you, my lord, she whispered. She took the spoon and quickly left the room. Mrs. Harris watched her go, then turned to Arthur, a look of slight confusion on her face. Milner is a good worker, she said, although she sometimes seems a little distracted. Distracted? Arthur asked, returning to the table. Well, the housekeeper shrugged. She's very diligent, but she seems to have her head in the clouds. Even so, she does her job flawlessly. I can't complain. Arthur nodded, pretending not to be interested, but a plan was already forming in his mind. He would watch her carefully and unobtrusively to find out who Grace Milner really was. For the next few days, Arthur looked at his house with new eyes. He noticed Grace everywhere, polishing the wood of the mantelpiece in the living room with almost reverent attention, arranging flowers in vases as though preparing for a duchess's reception, and talking to the younger maids. They listened to her unquestioningly, even though she never raised her voice. One morning, Arthur watched from his study window as Grace walked across the garden with a basket of laundry. She was wearing an old, faded, pale lavender dress that fit her graceful figure perfectly. The high waist under her bust, the long sleeves gathered at the shoulders, and the simple style all came together to make her look like she was wearing an outfit from a fashion magazine. She stopped at a rose bush, picked a wilted bud, and, in this graceful, fluid movement, betrayed her habit of a different life. Who had taught her to move like that? Her tutor, perhaps? That evening, there was a small reception at the house. Lady Margaret, Arthur's aunt, had insisted that he gradually return to social life. There were several neighbors and old friends of the family, making a total of 8 people at dinner. Arthur agreed more to get rid of his insistent relative than out of any sincere desire. The guests gathered in the large living room. The blazing fireplace cast warm reflections onto the golden tapestry-covered walls. Servants served wine and light snacks. Arthur chatted with his neighbor, Sir William Holbrook Ohm, about the latest news from Parliament, while keeping an eye on the door. Grace appeared with a tray of crystal glasses. She was wearing an austere black maid's dress with white cuffs and a collar, and her hair was tucked under a pristine white cap. She moved silently around the room, offering glasses to the guests, and was hardly noticed. She was the perfect servant, blending into the interior. But Arthur noticed her. He saw her gaze linger briefly on the portrait of his late father in full dress uniform above the fireplace. Something flashed in her eyes. Was it recognition or just interest? Creven, are you listening to me? Sir William raised his voice slightly. I apologize, he said, distracted. Arthur turned his attention back to his interlocutor. I was talking about the strange rumors I've heard that a certain gentleman has appeared in town looking for a missing heiress. Sir William lowered his voice and leaned closer. The daughter of the late Viscount Welford. Arthur pricked up his ears. Viscount Welford had died 5 years ago under strange circumstances, leaving behind enormous debts. His wife had died even earlier, and his only daughter. I thought the daughter had died too, he said. That's what they said, but now there are rumors that she's alive and that someone is very interested in finding her. Holbrook raised his eyebrow meaningfully. It has to do with the inheritance. It turns out the old man had a hidden fortune that no one knew about. Now his relatives want to divide it among themselves. But by law, it all goes to his daughter, if she's alive. Interesting, Arthur muttered, but his thoughts raced in another direction. Viscount Wellingford. He vaguely remembered him. An arrogant man with old-fashioned manners who was fond of classical literature. They had met a couple of times at the club. What was his daughter's name? He had never seen her. She was kept away from society and educated at home. He looked at Grace. She was standing by the window, clearing empty glasses away. Her profile was lit by candles. For a second, Arthur imagined her wearing different clothes. A silk dress with pearls around her neck and ribbons in her hair. At the thought, his heart skipped a beat. No, it was too unbelievable. The Viscount's daughter had become a servant. Why? And yet the evening dragged on painfully. Arthur kept up the conversation and smiled at the right moments. But his thoughts were occupied with only one thing. When the guests finally left, he went up to his room but couldn't bring himself to lie down. Instead, he went to his study and took out some old newspapers from 5 years ago. The obituary of Viscount Wellingford. A brief note about his death from a heart attack. There was a mention of debts and a short line at the end. The deceased had left behind a daughter, Grace Elizabeth Wellingford, age 17. Grace. Arthur leaned back in his chair, feeling a chill run down his spine. Coincidence? He had to find out. But how? Asking her directly would only scare her off. He had to be more careful. The next morning, Arthur deliberately summoned Grace to his office, saying that she needed to clean the bookshelves. Mrs. Harris was slightly surprised. Usually it was the other maids who did this, but she didn't argue. Grace appeared 10 minutes later with rags and a bucket. She entered with her eyes downcast and headed for the shelves by the window. "Good morning, Miss Milner," Arthur said without looking up from the papers on his desk. "Good morning, my lord." He watched her surreptitiously, pretending to read a letter. Grace methodically removed the books from the shelves, wiped them down and replaced them. Her hands moved confidently, but he noticed how she lingered briefly on one volume, Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. She ran her fingers along the spine as if stroking an old friend. "Are you interested in history, Miss Milner?" he asked casually. She started, nearly dropping the book. "A little, my lord. My father told me about it." "Your father was an educated man, I suppose?" "Yes, my lord." "What did he do? You said he was a teacher." Pause. Grace continued to dust the books, but her fingers trembled slightly. "He taught Latin and Greek at a boys' school." "Which school?" "A small private one. In Kent. It closed after his death." Arthur nodded, taking mental notes. She was lying. He could sense it because she was choosing her words too carefully and deliberately. "Were you born in Kent?" "Yes, sir." "And how did you end up in London?" She turned to face him now, and he could see the anxiety lurking behind her eyes. "After my father died, I had nowhere to go. I came to London to look for work. Mrs. Harris was kind enough to take me in." "You have no relatives, do?" "No, my lord, none." A lie, he could almost physically feel it, but why was she hiding the truth? What had happened to Viscount Wellingford's daughter? And if it was Grace, why was she hiding under a false name? Arthur rose from the table and walked to the window to look out at the garden. Grace froze. She didn't know whether to continue working. "Did you know my father?" he asked, not turning around. "Me? No, my lord, I never did." "Strange. Last night I noticed you looking at his portrait as if you recognized him." Silence, then a quiet sigh. He was a handsome man, my lord." "The portrait is very well done." Arthur turned to her. Grace stood with the book pressed to her chest, looking at him with an expression that broke his heart. It was a mixture of fear, determination, and quiet despair. "Grace," he said softly, and she flinched at the informal use of her name. "I am not your enemy if you are in trouble." "I am not in trouble, my lord," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I am just a servant who wants to do her job and live in peace. Please don't ask any more questions." There was such pleading in her words that Arthur instinctively backed away. He could see the tears glistening in her eyes. He saw her struggling not to cry. "All right," he said finally. "I won't. But know that if you need help, I'm here for you." Oh. Grace nodded without looking up and returned to the shelves. Arthur left the office, leaving her alone. In the hallway, he stopped and leaned against the wall. What was he doing? Why did this woman affect him so much? He had lost his wife 2 years ago and vowed never to open his heart again. And now a maid with a secret was turning his world upside down. But it was too late. He was hooked. The more she hid, the more he wanted to know the truth. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Sitting on the edge of her bed with her arms wrapped around her knees, she looked out of the window at the stars. Lord Craven had got too close. He was smart and observant. Sooner or later, he would put all the pieces of the puzzle together. What would happen when he found out who she was? She remembered that day 5 years ago. Her father lying lifeless in his study, creditors banging on the door. Then there was her uncle, who arrived at the funeral and calmly informed her that all the property had been confiscated to pay off the debts and that she would have to leave. He added, "Forget who you were, forget your name. If anyone finds out that you are alive," he continued, "you will be declared the heir to the debts. You will be imprisoned in a debtor's prison. Disappear. It's the only way to survive." She disappeared, changed her name and appearance, and learned to serve and keep quiet. For 5 years, she was nobody. She lived in the shadows for 5 years, afraid that someone would find out the truth. But now Lord Craven was looking at her, and there was too much understanding in his gaze. Worst of all, she was beginning to feel something in return, something dangerous. something that should not be. Grace closed her eyes, trying to chase away these thoughts, but Lord Craven's stern, attentive face with its dark, secretive eyes haunted her. I can't, she whispered into the darkness. I can't allow myself to feel this way. But her heart no longer listened to her mind. The April sun bathed London in unusual warmth. Tulips and daffodils bloomed in the Craven House garden, and the air was filled with the scent of the first roses. Arthur sat in his study, sorting through old letters from his late father, which were kept in a locked drawer of his desk. He hadn't opened the drawer in years. There had been no reason to before. However, when he needed some documents about the estate in Derbyshire this morning, he stumbled upon a bundle of yellowing envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. Most of the letters were business correspondence with managers, bankers, and lawyers. But one caught his attention. The envelope was made of thick paper and had a seal that he recognized. The coat of arms of Viscount Wellingford. Arthur slowly unfolded the letter. The handwriting was bold and confident, the handwriting of a man accustomed to giving orders. Dear Craven, Barnett began, thank you for your willingness to become my daughter's guardian in the event of my sudden death. I hope it will not be necessary, but it would reassure me to know that Grace would be under the protection of a man of honor. She is intelligent beyond her years, well-educated, and, I fear, too sensitive for the world in which we live. The will has been drawn up accordingly. If anything happens to me, you will receive a letter from my lawyer. I beg you to take care of her. She is all I have. Sincerely, Wellingford. Arthur slowly placed the letter on the table. It seemed that his father was supposed to become the guardian of Wellingford's daughter. But his father died 2 years before the Viscount. When the Viscount himself died, Arthur was on the continent, settling matters following his father's death and his own wedding. He knew nothing about this letter or the girl who had been left without protection. If Grace Milner was indeed Grace Wellingford, Arthur stood up and walked to the window. In the garden below, 2 maids were hanging laundry on lines. One of them was Grace. He recognized her by her posture. Today, she was wearing a simple, unbleached linen dress with short lantern sleeves and a square neckline. A coarse cloth apron was tied high under her chest. She was hanging sheets, and the wind was flapping the edges of the fabric against her figure, pressing her dress against her. Arthur stood there, unable to take his eyes off her. If she really was the Viscount's daughter, she must have been in hiding for 5 years. 5 years of living as a servant, afraid of being recognized. But why? Who was she hiding from? He remembered what Sir Holbrook had said about people searching for the heiress. What would happen if they found her? Debtor's prison, perhaps, or something worse. There was a knock at the door. Come in. Mrs. Harris entered, looking worried. My lord, she began, I'm sorry to disturb you, but a gentleman has arrived. Mr. Thomas Henderson. He said he has business with you concerning, she lowered her voice, the search for a missing person. I told him you might not want to see him, but he insists. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. There were too many coincidences. Show him into the small sitting room. I'll be down in a minute. The housekeeper nodded and left. Arthur quickly hid the Viscount's letter back in the drawer and locked it. Then he adjusted his tie and went downstairs. Mr. Henderson turned out to be a short man of about 40, with thin blonde hair and sharp, appraising eyes. He was wearing a sturdy, dark brown wool suit and was carrying a top hat and cane. When he saw Arthur, he stood up and bowed. Lord Craven, he said, thank you for agreeing to see me. My name is Thomas Henderson. I am a private investigator. I have been hired by the relatives of the late Viscount Wellingford to find his daughter. Please sit down, Mr. Henderson. Arthur pointed to a chair and sat down opposite me. I'm not sure how I can be of service to you, he said. Henderson took a small notebook out of his pocket. I have been conducting an investigation for several months, my lord. The Viscount's daughter, Grace Elizabeth Wellingford, disappeared shortly after her father's death. Her relatives believe she had died, but evidence has recently been found that suggests otherwise. The girl is alive, but she is hiding under a false name. Why would she need to hide? Henderson smiled because after the Viscount's death, all his property was confiscated to pay off his debts. As the sole heir, Grace was responsible for these debts. Had she been found then, she would have been sent to a debtor's prison. But now the situation has changed. How? A will has been discovered. It is an old will drawn up before the Viscount's wife died. It mentions a chest of jewels and documents hidden in a secret compartment at the family estate. This chest was found 3 months ago. Inside were diamonds, deeds to land abroad, and a large sum of money in banknotes. This is enough to cover all debts and still provide a decent inheritance. Henderson leaned forward. The relatives want to divide the inheritance among themselves, but according to the law, it all goes to the daughter. Therefore, they want to find her and convince her to renounce her rights. Or force her? Arthur asked coldly. Henderson shrugged. I'm just following orders, my lord. My job is to find the girl. What happens after that is none of my concern. What does this have to do with me? I discovered that your father, the late Lord Craven, was a close friend of the Viscount. There is reason to believe that he may have known where the girl was or even helped her hide. Henderson looked closely at Arthur. Did you find anything among your father's papers that might shed light on this story? Arthur kept his face impassive. No, my father died 7 years ago. I'm not familiar with his private affairs from that time. I see. Henderson clearly did not believe him, but he did not argue. He took a folded piece of paper from his inside pocket and handed it to Arthur. It was a sketch of a portrait made from descriptions of people who had seen Miss Wellingford as a child. Of course, she is an adult now and has changed, but her basic features should remain the same. If you or anyone you know encounters a woman who resembles this portrait, I would be very grateful if you could let me know. The relatives are offering a generous reward for any help in the search. Arthur took the drawing and his heart sank. The sketch was rough but recognizable. A thin face, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and large eyes. It was Grace. She looked younger and he had a different hairstyle, but it was her. He slowly folded the paper and put it in his pocket. I'll think about it, Mr. Henderson. If I remember or learn anything, I'll let you know. Thank you, sir. Henderson got up and left his business card on the table. I hope you can help. The girl is in no danger. Her relatives just want to settle the inheritance issue. Everything will be done in a civilized manner. Arthur walked him to the door, then returned to the living room and took out the drawing. He stood looking at Grace's face, his thoughts racing. She was in danger. Sooner or later, Henderson would track her down. What about her relatives? He didn't like the talk of civility. If they were willing to hire a detective, then they were capable of anything. He had to warn her, but how? If he told her he knew her secret, she would be frightened. She might try to run away. And if he kept quiet, Arthur clenched the drawing in his fist. No, he couldn't keep quiet. Not when she was in danger. Grace had finished hanging up the laundry and was returning to the house through the back door. Her hands were wet and red from the cold water. Her back ached slightly. The basket was heavy. She headed for the kitchen to help the cook prepare dinner. But Mrs. Harris stopped her in the hallway. Milner, she said, the Lord asked you to come up to his study. Grace froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Right away, Mrs. Harris. Yes, immediately, and tidy yourself up. You look like a scarecrow. Grace quickly went to her room, took off her apron, washed her face, and tidied her hair. Her hands trembled as she tied on a fresh apron. What could have happened? Why did the Lord want to see her? She went upstairs and knocked on the study door. Come in. Grace entered and closed the door behind her. Lord Craven was standing at the window with his back to her. His shoulders were tense and his hands were clenched behind his back. The silence lasted so long that she couldn't bear it. My lord, she said, you wanted to see me? He turned around and the expression on his face made her shiver. It wasn't anger, it was something else entirely. Concern and determination. Grace, he said, and again her name sounded strangely intimate. I need to talk to you. I ask you this time to be honest with me. She took a step back, pressing her hands against her skirt. My lord, I don't know your real name. Grace Elizabeth Wellingford. You are the daughter of the late Viscount. He said it calmly, without accusation, simply a statement of fact. The world spun around her. She grabbed the back of a chair, feeling her legs buckle. No, it can't be true. How did he find out? I'm not. You're mistaken. Don't, he interrupted gently. I know, and I'm not going to use it against you, but you should know that you are wanted. A private investigator hired by your relatives was just here. He showed me your portrait. Grace covered her face with her hands. trying to cope with the panic that had overwhelmed her. It's over. 5 years of hiding, 5 years of fear, and it all collapsed in an instant. They want to put me in debtor's prison, she whispered, her fingers covering her mouth. My father left huge debts. I'm the sole heir. If they find me, no. Arthur stepped towards her and gently rested his hands on her shoulders. Listen to me. The situation has changed. Your father's will has been found. It's in a chest with jewels and documents. There's enough there to cover all the debts. You don't owe anyone anything. Grace slowly lowered her hands and looked at him. His eyes were dark and serious, and the sincerity in them was more frightening than any threats could be. But why? Why are they looking for me? The inheritance. Your relatives want you to renounce it and transfer it to them. His hands tightened on her shoulders. I'm not sure they're prepared to accept a refusal. Grace felt tears rolling down her cheeks. For all these years, she had been running from debt, living in poverty and fear, and now it turned out that she was rich. And now the very people who had advised her to disappear wanted to take away what was rightfully hers. What should I do? She whispered. I can't run again. I'm so tired of running. Arthur pulled her closer and she did not resist. She pressed her forehead against his chest and listened to his heart beating beneath the fabric of his vest. His arms held her gently, as if he was afraid she would break. You will stay here, he said softly, under my protection. I will not let them take you away. My father promised your father that he would be your guardian. He couldn't keep that promise, but I will keep it for him. Grace lifted her head and looked into his face. They were standing so close that she could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes, the thin scar above his eyebrow, and the tight line of his lips. Why, she asked. Why do you want to help me? He looked at her for a long time, and something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. Because it's the right thing to do, he finally replied, and because I can't stand to see you suffer. The air between them thickened. Grace realized that his hands were still on her waist, and her palms were resting on his chest. There were only a few inches between their faces. All she had to do was stand on her tiptoes. Instead, she pulled away sharply, taking a step back. Her heart was pounding so hard that it felt as if it were about to jump out of her chest. This is crazy, she thought. He's a lord. She's a servant. No, not a servant. The daughter of a viscount. But what difference does that make? She's poor with no status or future. I'm sorry, she breathed. I shouldn't have, Grace. His voice stopped her. There's no need to apologize to me. I crossed the line. She shook her head, unable to find the words. Emotions raged inside her. She felt relief that the secret was out and fear for the future. And there was this new, frightening attraction to the man who had offered her protection. What happens now? She asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Now we decide what to do. Arthur returned to the table as if he was also trying to come to terms with his overwhelming emotions. You are entitled to your father's inheritance, but to claim it, you must make an official claim. That means your relatives will find out where you are. They'll take everything, Grace said bitterly. They'll find a way with money and connections. I have none of that. I do, Arthur replied calmly. If you allow me, I will use them to protect your rights. Grace looked at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Why was this man, a virtual stranger, willing to take such a risk for her? I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. He moved closer and there was something unyielding in his eyes. Grace, your father trusted my father. Let me live up to that trust. She wanted to refuse, to say that she could manage on her own, but after 5 years of lies and fear, she was overwhelmed by exhaustion and couldn't hold out. All right, she whispered. All right. Relief flashed across Arthur's face. Then here's what we'll do. You will continue to live here, but not as a servant. I'll announce that you're a distant relative who has come to visit. That should stop the gossip and give us time to prepare. The servants know, but they'll keep quiet if I order them to. Mrs. Harris is good at keeping secrets too. He took her hand, and the warmth of his palm was reassuring. Trust me, Grace, please. She looked at their intertwined fingers. His hand was large and strong with old calluses. while hers was small with reddened skin from work. Two different worlds, connected by this simple touch. "I trust you," she said quietly. And in that moment, something changed between them forever. The transformation happened overnight, but it felt like an earthquake. Arthur arranged for Grace to be moved from the attic room to a room in the East Wing, the same room that had been empty since Elizabeth's death. Mrs. Harris took the news in silence, but her eyes betrayed her amazement. The other servants whispered in the kitchen, speculating, but they knew better than to question the master's orders. Standing in the middle of her new bedroom, Grace couldn't believe what was happening. The room was huge, 10 times larger than her previous quarters. It had high ceilings with moldings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, a four-poster bed with pale blue silk curtains, a mahogany dressing table, and an armchair by the fireplace. The walls were adorned with elegant floral wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick, soft carpet. "Miss Harris, this is too much," she whispered to the housekeeper. "I can't. My lord insisted," the woman replied dryly. "He said you are a distant cousin who has come from the countryside to stay with us indefinitely. He also said that you should be treated as a member of the family." There was neither approval nor condemnation in her tone, only a statement of fact. Grace nodded gratefully. "I understand that it seems strange. It's not my place to judge, Miss Wellingford." Mrs. Harris called her by her real name for the first time, and Grace flinched. "My lord is a good man. If he has decided to help you, he has his reasons. Mary, the maid, will attend to you. She is young, but she is reliable and knows how to keep her mouth shut. Thank you." The housekeeper lingered at the door. "Miss," she said, "forgive my boldness, but be careful. High society does not forgive mistakes, and Lord Craven has been alone for too long. People will talk." "I know," Grace replied quietly, "and I will try not to damage his reputation." When Mrs. Harris left, Grace sank into a chair by the window. Her hands were shaking. Everything was happening too fast. Yesterday she was a servant. Today, what was she? A guest? A ward? Or something else she was afraid to even think about? A knock at the door brought her out of her reverie. A young maid entered with an armful of dresses. "Miss Wellingford," she said, "my lord asked me to bring you some clothes. They belong to the late Lady Craven. He said you are about the same height." Grace froze. Wearing the clothes of a deceased woman seemed wrong, almost sacrilegious. "Mary, I can't." "My lord said that the lady would be pleased if her things served a good purpose," the girl said softly. "And you have no other clothes except—" She fell silent, not daring to say servant's clothes. Grace slowly approached the bed where Mary had laid out the dress. There were 6 of them, day and evening dresses. One caught her attention. It was made of fine ivory-colored wool and had a high waist and long sleeves gathered in graceful folds at the shoulders. Gold thread embroidery adorned the hem and neckline. It was simple yet elegant, just the thing to wear at home during the day. "It's beautiful," Mary said. "Let's try it on," Grace nodded. The girl helped her undress and put on the new dress. The fabric was soft and pleasant to the touch. When Mary had fastened the small buttons at the back and adjusted the folds, Grace walked over to the tall mirror. The woman looking back at her in the mirror was a stranger. The dress fit her perfectly, emphasizing her figure without being provocative. Without the gray muslin and apron and with her hair down, which Mary began to comb, she looked like a lady, like the girl she had been before her father's fall. "You are beautiful, miss," Mary whispered admiringly. Grace ran her hand over the fabric, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief. She put on her mask again, but this time it was a different one. The mask of a noble lady instead of a maid. Which was the real her? Arthur did not see Grace until the evening. He deliberately avoided going up to the East Wing, giving her time to settle in. However, at dinner, when Mrs. Harris reported that Miss Wellingford was feeling uncomfortable and requested permission to dine in her quarters, he could not resist. "Tell Miss Wellingford that I will be waiting for her for dinner in the small dining room at 7 o'clock. The housekeeper bowed and withdrew, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. What was he doing? He had invited a young woman with a mysterious past into his home, a woman whose presence would cause gossip, and now he could think of nothing else. He was obsessed with her eyes, her voice, and the way she carried herself despite her fear. Elizabeth had died 2 years ago. Their marriage had been happy enough, but there had been no passion. It was a convenient union between two noble families, a quiet affection that never developed into something deeper. When she died of childbed fever alongside their child, Arthur mourned, but his grief was muted, almost formal. He closed the east wing, locked the doors, and vowed never to open his heart again. Now Grace slept in those rooms and wore Elizabeth's dresses, evoking in him only a strange sense of relief. It was as if the ghost of the past had finally left him alone. At 7 o'clock, he went down to the small dining room. The fireplace was lit. Candles and silver candlesticks stood on the table. The aroma of roasted game wafted from the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of wine, then went to the window and looked out at the darkening garden. The clock struck 7. The door opened. Arthur turned around and forgot how to breathe. Grace stood in the doorway wearing an ivory dress that he remembered Elizabeth wearing. However, it looked completely different on her. The gold embroidery shimmered softly in the candlelight. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant updo, revealing her graceful neck, with a few dark curls falling over her temples. She held her hands folded in front of her, and her posture betrayed her uncertainty. Though her back was straight, her chin was lifted. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting," she said. Her voice trembled. Arthur took a step forward, unable to take his eyes off her. "You look beautiful." A slight blush touched her cheeks. Mary had tried very hard. "I hardly recognize myself in the mirror." "But it's you," he said quietly, "the real you, the person you should have been all these years." Grace lowered her gaze and he saw her eyelashes tremble. He moved closer and held out his hand. "Let me show you to your seat." She placed her fingers on his palm, a light, almost weightless touch, but it burned him like a flame. He seated her opposite him and the servants began to serve dinner. The first few minutes passed in silence. Grace hardly ate, merely shifting pieces of pheasant around her plate. Arthur could see how tense her shoulders were. "Grace," he began softly, "it's just us here. You don't need to be afraid." She looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I've been pretending to be someone else for so long that I've forgotten how to be myself, how to sit at a table, how to talk. It's like I'm wearing someone else's dress that doesn't fit me." Arthur leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "Tell me about yourself, the real you." Grace Wellingford, who existed before everything fell apart. She fell silent, then slowly began to speak. "I grew up on my father's estate in Surrey. We had a big house with a library and gardens. My father loved antiquity and collected books and manuscripts. My mother died when I was 10. After that, he became even more withdrawn. I was his only outlet. He taught me Latin, Greek, history, and philosophy. He said that an educated woman was a rarity that the world did not appreciate, but that she was valuable in her own right." Her voice softened and warmed when she remembered her father. "We spent our evenings in the library reading Virgil and Cicero. He told me about Rome and its great emperors and philosophers. I was happy then. I had no idea that he was gambling, that his debts were mounting, and that it would all end in disaster." "Did you love him?" Arthur asked simply. "Very much, despite everything." A tear rolled down her cheek and she brushed it away. "When he died and my uncle told me I had to disappear, I believed him. I thought it was the only way, but now I understand. He just wanted to get rid of me so he could take what was left." "Is your uncle one of the people looking for you?" "Yes. Thomas Wellingford, my father's younger brother, has always been jealous of him and has always thought that the title should have been his." Bitterness colored her words. And now he had his chance. Arthur leaned forward, his voice hardening. "He won't get what he wants. I give you my word." Grace looked at him, her gaze long and full of gratitude and something else. It made his heart beat faster. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You're risking everything for me, and I have nothing to give you in return." Arthur wanted to talk about his duty to his father's memory, honor, and promises, but the words that came out of his mouth were different. "Because when I look at you, for the first time in 2 years, I feel alive. You have awakened something in me that I thought was dead." A heavy, tense silence hung between them. Grace did not look away, and in her gaze he saw a reflection of his own feelings. Fear, desire, and the sense of impossibility. "My Lord Arthur." She called him by name for the first time, and hearing her say it was as sweet as honey. "We mustn't," he interrupted. "I know," he interrupted. "You are my ward. You depend on my protection. It would be wrong, but it is there," she finished for him. "It is there, and we both feel it." Arthur closed his eyes, fighting the urge to stand up, walk around the table, and pull her towards him. But he couldn't. She was right. As long as she was under his protection and her position was precarious, any intimacy would exploit her vulnerability. "Then we'll fight it," he said hoarsely, "until your case is resolved, until you are free." "And then," she whispered, "we'll see." The rest of dinner passed in tense silence, filled with unspoken words. When the servants had cleared the table and Arthur escorted Grace to her rooms, their fingers touched at the door to the east wing. A brief but burning touch. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Arthur." Arthur stood in the hallway long after the door had closed, listening to the sounds from behind it. When he finally went to his own rooms, he knew he wouldn't sleep. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Lady Margaret, Arthur's aunt, arrived unannounced, as usual. A tall, imperious woman in her 60s, she wore a dark burgundy dress with a lace collar and a feathered hat. She burst into the living room like a commander on the battlefield. "Arthur, I've heard some incredible things," she announced from the doorway. "Mrs. Darcy from next door told me that you have a young lady staying with you. A cousin, as you call her. But I don't remember any cousins in our family." Arthur, who was reading the newspaper by the fireplace, slowly put it aside. "Good morning, Auntie. It's good to see you. Don't dodge the question." She sat down opposite him and pierced her nephew with a sharp gaze. "Who is this girl and what is she doing here?" At that moment, the door opened and Grace entered. She was wearing a dark green velvet dress with long sleeves and a modest neckline. Her hair was plaited and arranged in a crown on her head. Seeing the unfamiliar woman, Grace froze. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you had guests." "Come in, Grace." Arthur stood up. "This is my aunt, Lady Margaret." "Aunt, allow me to introduce you. This is Miss Grace Wellingford, daughter of the late Viscount Wellingford." Lady Margaret raised her eyebrows so high that they almost disappeared under her hat. "Wellingford," she said, "the very same Wellingford who died in debt. But I thought his daughter was dead." "The living daughter is under my protection," Arthur said firmly. His aunt slowly examined Grace from head to toe. Her gaze was appraising, yet not unkind. Grace held herself with dignity, though Arthur could see her fingers turning white as she clenched them in the folds of her skirt. "Come closer, child," Lady Margaret finally said. Grace approached and curtsied deeply, the movement betraying years of etiquette training. "Lady Margaret, it's an honor to meet you," Auntie snorted. "At least you have manners. Sit down and tell me how the Viscount's daughter ended up in my nephew's house." Grace glanced quickly at Arthur. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "Trust me." "After my father's death," Grace began cautiously, "I was left alone. The family had accumulated considerable debts, and I was advised to go into hiding until the situation was resolved. I lived modestly under a different name. Recently, I learned that the late Lord Craven had promised my father that he would become my guardian if he died. When I approached the current Lord Craven, he was kind enough to honor his father's promise. That was true, but not the whole truth. Lady Margaret clearly understood this, but decided not to investigate further. "And where have you been living at all these years?" "I've been working," Grace replied quietly. "Working," Auntie turned to Arthur. "She's been working. Viscount's daughter." "Yes," Arthur confirmed calmly. "She survived in the only way available to her, and for that she should be respected, not condemned." Lady Margaret looked at Arthur for a long time, then back at Grace. Suddenly, an almost imperceptible smile appeared on her face. "Well, Arthur, you've finally started living. For 2 years you walked around like a ghost. Now," she didn't finish her sentence, but the meaning was clear. "Miss Welford, if my nephew has taken you under his wing, then you are fortunate. He is stubborn as a mule, but honest. However, remember that high society will not forgive scandal. If you stay here without proper accompaniment, the gossip will spread throughout London within a week." Grace paled, and Arthur frowned. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest that I move here for a while," her aunt replied calmly. I will be a companion to Miss Wellingford. That way everything will be proper. An old widow, a young girl, and a noble guardian. No one would dare say a bad word. Amen. Arthur wanted to object. His aunt's presence would mean the end of their fragile intimacy and quiet evenings spent having frank conversations. But he knew she was right. Grace's reputation was more important than his personal desires. You're right, he admitted. Thank you. Lady Margaret rose, adjusting her hat. I'll move tomorrow. In the meantime, Miss Wellingford, let's take a walk in the garden. I need to know who I'm dealing with. Grace stood up and gave Arthur a pleading look, but he only smiled encouragingly at her. When the women left, he sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. Things were getting complicated, and he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. The next day, Lady Margaret arrived at Craven House with enough luggage to stay for a year. The servants were rushing back and forth once again, carrying trunks, hat boxes, and even a cage containing a canary, which his aunt had categorically refused to leave at home. The bird keeps me company in the mornings, she explained to Arthur, who watched the chaos with barely concealed horror. And don't you dare say it will be a nuisance. Mr. Pepys is a gentleman and knows when to keep quiet. Grace watched the proceedings from the living room window, and for the first time in many days, a smile played on her lips. Lady Margaret was like a hurricane, loud and domineering, but there was something disarming about her directness. On the evening of her first day, her aunt convened what she called a family council. The three of them gathered in the small living room. Arthur sat by the fireplace. Grace sat on the sofa in a pink muslin dress with short puffed sleeves and a white satin ribbon under the bust. And Lady Margaret sat in an armchair, directing the conversation like a commander in battle. So, she began, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup, we need to decide what to do next. Miss Wellingford, your relatives are looking for you. There's no point in hiding. Sooner or later, they'll find out where you are. That means we need to act first. I've already contacted a lawyer, said Arthur. Sir James Whitfield is one of the best in London. He's studying the Wellingford case documents. Fine, but legal battles take time, said Lady Margaret, narrowing her eyes. Lady Margaret narrowed her eyes. And in the meantime, the girl must appear in society. If we keep her locked up, it will arouse suspicion. People will start to think she has something to hide. Grace clutched the cup in her hands. But I can't, she said. I'm not ready to meet people who knew my family. What if someone finds out? Let them find out, her aunt snapped. You're not a criminal. You're a victim of circumstance. There's no shame in surviving the only way you could. We'll introduce you to society as a distant relative who has lived in the provinces for a long time and has only recently returned. Arthur is your guardian. I am your companion. Everything is above board. But if your uncle finds out, the scoundrel who abandoned you to your fate, Lady Margaret said harshly, if he shows up here, I will personally throw him out. I have more connections than he does. You can be sure of that. Arthur put down his glass and walked over to Grace. He knelt down next to the sofa so that they were at eye level. Grace, your aunt is right. Hiding is not the answer, but we won't rush into anything. We'll start small. Lady Catherine Harrington is hosting a reception at her house the day after tomorrow. It will be a small gathering of about 30 people. It'll be a good opportunity to introduce you to some people. I'll be there too. So will your aunt. Grace looked into his dark eyes, which were full of determination and something else, a warmth that made her heart beat unevenly. Since Lady Margaret moved in, they had hardly been alone together. Every glance and accidental touch was now under her aunt's watchful eye. This closeness that could not be realized was sweet torture. All right, she whispered. I'll try. Arthur squeezed her hand quickly and almost imperceptibly, then got up and walked over to the window. Lady Margaret watched this exchange with an unreadable expression on her face. The 2 days before the reception flew by in a flurry of activity. Lady Margaret took it upon herself to prepare Grace for her debut. She summoned the dressmaker, ordered several of the late Lady Craven's dresses to be altered to fit Grace, and commissioned 2 new ones. Pink muslin is fine for at home, but something more impressive is needed for the reception, she declared, sorting through the fabrics that the dressmaker had laid out in the living room. She chose a piece of sea green silk. With your hair and eyes, you will look like a vision, she said. Grace stood while the dressmaker took her measurements, feeling like a doll, but there was something pleasant about it. The attention, the care, and the feeling that someone was thinking about her. For 5 years, she had been a nobody. Now she was becoming someone again. Arthur rarely appeared. He was busy with meetings with his lawyer, trips to the city and estate matters. However, Grace caught his long, intense glances at breakfast and dinner, full of unspoken desire. Every time their eyes met, the air between them thickened and it became difficult to breathe. One evening, when Lady Margaret retired to her chambers with a headache, Grace went down to the library. She hadn't been there since the night it all began. Now it seemed right to return, to close the circle. The room was quiet, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. Grace walked over to the shelf where she had once found Tacitus's annals, ran her fingers over the spines, and froze when she heard footsteps behind her. "Can't sleep." Arthur's voice was low and hoarse. Grace slowly turned around. He stood in the doorway wearing a dark blue velvet dressing gown over a white shirt. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he had been tossing and turning in bed. In the dim moonlight, his face looked as if it had been carved from marble. He had sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, and lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought everyone was asleep," she whispered. "I'm awake too." He entered the library and closed the door behind him. "Too many thoughts. What are you thinking about?" He moved closer and Grace caught the scent of his cologne. Something woody, with hints of sandalwood. Her heart beat faster. "About you," he replied honestly. "Always about you. Ever since the day I saw you here with a book in your hands. I can't get you out of my head, Grace." She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to step towards him, to press herself against him and feel the warmth of his body. "We mustn't," she said. "Lady Margaret is asleep upstairs. If anyone sees us—" I could hear the anguish in his voice. "I know I have no right to look at you like this. You are my ward. I must protect you, not desire you," she finished, opening her eyes. Their gazes met, and Arthur took a step forward, closing the distance between them to a mere inch. Grace saw his chest heave and his jawline tense as the moonlight danced in his dark eyes. "I'm trying to be noble now," he croaked, "but every day it gets harder." "Then don't," she whispered, raising her hand to touch his cheek. The touch of her fingers was like a spark to gunpowder. Arthur exhaled, took her hand in his, pressed it to his face, closed his eyes, and she saw his eyelashes tremble. "Grace," he said, "if I start, I won't be able to stop. Then don't stop." He pulled her towards him sharply and desperately. One hand slid to her waist, and the other buried itself in her hair, scattering the pins. Grace gasped at the suddenness of it, but immediately wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed closer. Their foreheads touched, their breaths mingled, and for a moment time stood still. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his lips so close that she could feel them moites. "No," she breathed. Arthur kissed her slowly and gently as if he were afraid of breaking her. His lips were warm and his taste was sweet. Grace felt the whole world shrink to this moment, to this touch. Although she had never kissed anyone before, her body knew what to do. Her lips parted and her hands slid into his hair. The kiss deepened, becoming greedy and demanding. Arthur pressed her back against the bookcase and she gasped softly in surprise. But the sound was swallowed by his mouth. His hands slid down her back, leaving a burning trail through the fabric of her dress. She responded with equal passion, clutching the hem of his robe and pulling him closer, wanting more. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. They froze, gasping for breath. Arthur pulled away abruptly. Coldness came between them. Grace leaned against the shelf, her legs buckling and her lips burning. "Someone's coming," he whispered, listening. The footsteps in the hallway were measured and heavy. The butler or one of the servants. Arthur quickly adjusted his robe and ran his hand through his hair. Grace tried to smooth her tousled hair, but several stubborn curls fell onto her shoulders. They looked at each other and saw regret and relief in each other's eyes. "I have to go," he said hoarsely, "before I lose what's left of my mind." "Arthur, don't." He raised his hand, stopping her. "If you say anything now, I won't be able to leave, and I have to, for your sake." He turned and left the library, leaving her alone in the dark. Grace sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her heart was beating so hard that it felt as though it might jump out of her chest. Her lips still tasted of his kiss, and her whole body was on fire. What had they done? How could she live with this knowledge, knowing that what existed between them was not meant to be? The morning of the reception came too quickly. Grace spent several hours in her chambers while Mary helped her get dressed and do her hair. The sea green silk dress was magnificent. The bodice fit snugly, emphasizing the graceful line of her neck and shoulders. The short sleeves barely covered her shoulders, and the skirt did not fall in soft folds to the floor. Silver embroidery adorned the hem and neckline, and white elbow-length gloves completed the look. Mary styled Grace's hair into a high updo, leaving a few curls to frame her face and wove a silver ribbon into it. When Grace looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her was elegant and confident, exactly what a viscount's daughter should be. "You are beautiful, miss," Mary whispered admiringly. "The Lord will not be able to take his eyes off you." Grace blushed, remembering the night in the library. They had not spoken since then. Arthur had been avoiding her, and she herself did not know what to say. But tonight they would have to be together. They would have to pretend that nothing had happened. Lady Margaret was already waiting for them downstairs. She wore a majestic, dark purple velvet dress with a high collar and long sleeves adorned with a pearl brooch. A turban adorned with a feather crowned her gray hair. "At last," she announced, looking at Grace. "Excellent, Arthur. Look at our girl." Arthur stood at the foot of the stairs in his evening suit. He wore a black tailcoat, a white waistcoat, and an immaculately tied tie. As Grace descended the steps, he looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. His dark eyes burned and his breathing quickened. When she approached, he reached out his hand to help her with the last few steps. His voice broke. "You look just as you should." She smiled uncertainly. "Like a dream," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. His fingers squeezed her hand tighter than necessary. Grace felt the heat rise up her arm and spread throughout her body. "Well, shall we go?" Lady Margaret asked impatiently. "It's not proper to be late. The carriage is waiting at the door." Arthur helped the ladies in and they set off. Arthur helped the ladies in and they set off. Lady Catherine Harrington's house was in Mayfair, a few blocks from Craven House. The journey was short, but to Gray it seemed like an eternity. Sitting opposite Arthur, she felt a spark every time the carriage bounced over uneven pavements. Lady Harrington's house was lit by hundreds of candles. Guests were already gathering in the large drawing room. The ladies wore silk and satin, while the gentlemen were dressed for the evening. Soft music played from a string quartet. Servants carried champagne and canapes. The air was filled with the sense of perfume, wax, and roses in tall vases. When Arthur, Grace, and Lady Margaret arrived, several heads turned in their direction. Grace felt curious glances sliding over her and instinctively moved closer to Arthur. His hand rested on her back. It was a barely noticeable touch, but it was so supportive. "Calm down," he whispered. "I'm here." Lady Catherine, the hostess, approached with a broad smile. A full-figured woman in her 50s, she radiated good nature in her low-cut golden silk dress. "Arthur, my dear," she said, "it's been so long since we've seen you. Lady Margaret is always delighted, and this must be your guest. Lady Catherine, allow me to introduce you. Miss Grace Wellingford, my ward." Lady Catherine gave Grace an appraising look, then smiled even more broadly. "Charming. Welcome, dear Arthur. You've kept her a secret for too long. Such a beauty should be shown to society." Grace curtsied. "Thank you for the invitation." "Lady Catherine, come, I'll introduce you to the others." The next hour was spent making introductions. Grace smiled, nodded, and answered questions, trying not to show how nervous she was. Most of the guests were friendly, although some of the ladies looked at her with either ill-concealed curiosity or envy. Arthur stayed close to her. His presence was an anchor that kept her afloat. Then, while she was talking to an elderly gentleman about Italian painting, someone called out to her. "Grace! Grace Wellford!" The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Grace slowly turned and saw the man she had hoped never to see again. Her uncle, Thomas Wellingford, stood a few steps away from her. He was tall, with receding hair and cold gray eyes. He looked at her with an expression of triumph on his face. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, approaching her. "Niece, we've been looking for you for so long." The world around Grace spun. This couldn't be happening here now. Arthur immediately stepped forward and blocked her with his body. "Mr. Wellingford, I believe I am Lord Craven." Miss Wellingford is under my guardianship. Her uncle smirked. How touching. A guardian. And how long has that been going on, my lord? There was a hint of mockery in his voice. As her closest relative, I have more rights to guardianship over my niece than you do. Your rights are being contested, Arthur replied coldly. And they will be contested in court if necessary. The conversation attracted the attention of those around them. The guests fell silent, watching the developments with curiosity. Lady Margaret appeared next to Grace, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. Thomas Wellingford looked at Grace over Arthur's shoulder. Niece, you should return to the family. We have matters to discuss. Your father's inheritance, which you are trying to claim, interrupted Lady Margaret. Mr. Wellingford, I advise you not to continue this conversation here. If you have any claims, please contact your lawyers. Her uncle clenched his jaw, but was forced to back down under the weight of so many eyes on him. Very well, then, he said, but know this, I will not let this rest. Grace, you are making a mistake in trusting these people. He turned and left the room. Silence hung heavily in the air. Then Lady Catherine clapped her hands. Well, gentlemen, let us continue the evening. Musicians, play something cheerful. The music started again. Conversations resumed, but Grace felt that everyone was still watching her. Arthur took her by the elbow. Let's go and get some air, he said. He led her through the glass doors into the garden. The night air was cool and smelt of lilacs and damp earth. Grace leaned against the stone balustrade of the terrace, trying to stop her hands from trembling. He found me, she whispered. It's over. No, Arthur stood beside her and turned her towards him. Mumming is over. He tried to intimidate you, but he didn't succeed. We'll fight, Grace, and we'll win. She looked into his moonlit face and saw his unwavering determination. Why are you so sure? Because I won't let him take you away, he replied simply. Not him, not anyone else. Grace felt tears burning in her eyes. She stepped forward, and Arthur pulled her close to his chest. They stood there in the silence of the garden, and the outside world ceased to exist. I'm scared, she confessed, her voice muffled by the fabric of his tailcoat. Me too, he whispered into her hair. But together we are stronger. In that moment, Grace realized that, whatever happened next, she was no longer alone. And that changed everything. After the reception at Lady Harrington's, events unfolded rapidly. The next morning, a clerk arrived at Raven House with a court summons. Thomas Wellingford had officially contested Arthur's guardianship of Grace, demanding that she be recognized as the sole heir to the late Viscount's debts. The document was drafted to discredit Grace as much as possible. It mentioned her disappearance and hinted at her questionable lifestyle during those years. Even her stay at the bachelor lord's house was presented as scandalous. Arthur read these lines and his face became increasingly stony. Grace sat opposite him in the living room, wearing a long-sleeved lilac linen dress with a modest lace collar, trying to remain calm. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret paced the room, tapping her cane on the floor, a sure sign of her anger. That scoundrel, she finally blurted out. He's trying to ruin the girl's reputation to deprive her of her inheritance. But we won't let him. Right, Arthur? Right, he confirmed grimly, putting the documents aside. Sir James is already working on a response. He is studying all of the late Viscount's papers, looking for any evidence. At that moment, the butler entered the living room. My lord, Sir James Whitfield has arrived. He says he has urgent news. Show him in immediately. The lawyer entered with a leather briefcase under his arm and an expression of restrained triumph on his face. He was a short man of about 50, wearing an immaculate black suit with piercing gray eyes. Lord Craven, Lady Margaret, Miss Wellingford. He bowed. I have news that changes everything. Speak. Arthur gestured for him to sit down. Sir James took several yellow documents out of his briefcase. I visited Mr. Fielding, the former lawyer of the late Viscount Welford. The old man is very old and has been retired for years, but he agreed to meet me and told me something astonishing. He looked at Grace. Your father, Miss Wellingford, made a new will 6 months before his death. A secret will, one that not even your uncle knew about. In it, he acknowledged his debts, but also referenced hidden assets that were to be passed on to you after his death. Grace jumped up from her seat. Hidden assets? But I knew nothing about them. That is why the Viscount left this letter with his lawyer, Sir James continued. He was afraid that creditors or relatives would get to them before the time was right. Mr. Fielding was supposed to give you this letter when you turned 21 or got married. But when the Viscount died, you disappeared and the old man couldn't find you. What's in the letter? Arthur asked tensely. The lawyer unfolded the yellowed sheet of paper and his voice sounded steady and clear. My dear Grace, he began, if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer here. Mr. Fielding has fulfilled his duty. Forgive me for all the mistakes I have made. Gambling ruined me, but I did not want it to ruin you too. In the basement of our estate, in the old wine room, behind the rack of empty bottles, there is a hiding place in the wall. There you will find an iron chest. Inside are your mother's jewels, which I have kept for you, the deeds to land in France that she inherited from her family, and a large sum of money in banknotes. This should be enough to cover all my debts and provide you with a decent inheritance. Also, know that I have asked my friend James Craven to be your guardian. He swore to me. If he is still alive, turn to him. If not, turn to his son. The Craven family has never broken their word. Forgive me and be happy, your loving father. Silence hung in the room. Grace slowly sank back into her chair, pressing her hand to her chest. Her heart was beating so hard that she found it difficult to breathe. I didn't know, she whispered. My father died so suddenly. The day after the funeral, my uncle came and said that everything was lost and that I had to run away, or else I would be sent to a debtor's prison. I believed him. I was so scared. Arthur knelt down beside her chair and took her hands in his. Your uncle lied to you. He knew that as a minor, you couldn't be imprisoned for your father's debts. He wanted you to disappear so that he could take what was left for himself. That's right, confirmed Sir James. Mr. Fielding tried to find Miss Wellingford, but you seem to have vanished. He waited, hoping you would show up. When he learned from my clerk that you were alive and in Lord Craven's care, he immediately handed over all the documents to me. Lady Margaret sank into a chair, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. So the girl doesn't owe anything. She has an inheritance. Moreover, Sir James produced another document. It is a letter from the late Lord Craven to the Viscount, confirming his agreement to become Miss Grace's guardian should the Viscount die. This proves the legitimacy of the current Lord Craven's guardianship, as he is fulfilling his father's promise. Arthur looked up at the lawyer. That's enough for court. More than enough. We have a will certified by a notary. Letters. We have a witness in the person of Mr. Fielding. Mr. Thomas Wellingford's case is doomed. Sir James allowed himself to smile. But we need to retrieve the contents of the chest from the estate. That will be the final proof. Is the estate empty now? Arthur asked. Yes, after it was confiscated, they tried to sell it several times, but there were no buyers. It's too run down and requires a lot of investment. It formally belongs to the bank, but there's no security there. It's expensive to maintain, and there's nothing of value left in it. Arthur looked at Grace. We have to go there tonight. She nodded, squeezing his fingers. I'm afraid to go back there. But if you're with me, I will, he said firmly. They always left after midnight, just as Grace had left this house 5 years ago. Then she had been running away. Now she was returning to reclaim what was hers. Arthur drove the carriage again, and Grace sat next to him, wrapped in a dark cloak. Sir James accompanied them as a witness and to take an inventory of the found property. The night air was fresh, smelling of the approaching summer. The road seemed endless, and Grace kept squeezing Arthur's hand for support. Each time she did so, he squeezed back, silently letting her know, you are not alone. Tell me about the house, he said as they left the city. How do you remember it? Grace closed her eyes, immersing herself in memories. It was large and bright with high ceilings and a suite of rooms. There was a library with carved oak paneling where her father spent entire days. There was a living room with a grand piano where her mother played. I only remember fragments of the melodies she played, but I remember how my father would listen with his eyes closed. There was a garden with white roses and lavender. My room was on the second floor, and I could see the old oak tree where I had built a secret hideout as a child. Her voice trembled with overwhelming emotion. I thought I would never see it again. I thought the house had died with my father. Houses don't die, Arthur said quietly. They wait. and today your house waited for you." The estate greeted them in the pre-dawn mist. The tall Georgian-style house with columns looked like a ghost of itself. The plaster was peeling, the windows were broken, and the garden was overgrown. The fountain at the entrance was dry, and ivy covered the walls, as if trying to engulf the building. Grace got out of the carriage and stood still, looking at her childhood home. Tears stung her eyes. It was painful to see how time and neglect had destroyed its former beauty. "It's still beautiful," Arthur said, standing beside her. "Underneath it all, it can be restored." "You think so?" "I know it can." He took her hand. "Now let's go. Will you show us where the basement is?" The front door was locked, but Grace remembered another way in, the old greenhouse at the back of the house. The windows had been broken for a long time, so they slipped inside easily. Inside there was a smell of damp, mold, and neglect. The furniture was covered with dust sheets. The portraits on the walls had darkened with age. Every step echoed through the empty rooms. Grace led them through familiar corridors, and memories came flooding back. Here in the hallway, she used to play hopscotch with the maids. That door led to the small living room where she and her father used to drink tea on Sundays. She had run down this staircase every morning to be the first to get to breakfast. The basement door was behind the kitchen. Arthur pushed open the heavy oak door with rusty hinges, which creaked as it opened. Stone steps led down into the darkness, and the air below was cold and musty. Arthur lit the lantern they had brought with them, and they began to descend. Grace held his hand, feeling her heart beat faster and faster. Sir James followed behind, stepping carefully on the slippery stones. The cellar was vast. Several rooms were filled with old furniture, chests, and empty barrels. The wine room was at the very end. The door was ajar, and Grace remembered how her father had brought her here when she was 10, showing her his wine collection and telling her stories about each bottle. Now, however, most of the shelves were empty. The creditors had taken everything of value, but in the far corner there was an old shelf with dusty bottles that they had deemed worthless. Grace pointed to it with a trembling hand. Arthur and Sir James grabbed the heavy wooden structure behind the shelf and moved it aside. Behind it was an unremarkable stone wall. Grace came closer, though, ran her fingers over the stones, found a protrusion, and pressed it. One of the stones gave way, and part of the wall slid aside to reveal a niche the size of a small cupboard. Inside stood an iron chest covered in rust and cobwebs. Arthur crouched down and carefully pulled the chest out. It was heavy. The lock was old but sturdy. "We don't have a key," said Sir James. "We don't need one." Arthur took a small knife from his pocket, inserted it into the keyhole, and fiddled with it for a few seconds. The lock clicked open. He lifted the lid. Even in the dim light of the lantern, the chest's contents sparkled. There were jewels, necklaces, bracelets, brooches, and rings set with emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. They lay in velvet pouches. Beneath these were bundles of banknotes tied with ribbons and rolled into tubes, as well as documents. Grace knelt down next to Arthur, unable to believe her eyes. These were her mother's jewels. She remembered some of them. There was the pearl necklace her mother wore to balls. There was the emerald brooch that her mother had worn with her everyday dresses. And there was the diamond wedding ring. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks. She picked up the ring and pressed it to her lips. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm back. I'm finally back." Arthur hugged her, and she pressed herself against his shoulder, allowing herself to cry tears of grief, relief, and joy. All these years, she had thought she had lost everything. But it turned out that her father had taken care of her. Even though he was mired in debt and knew what awaited him, he had secured her future. Meanwhile, Sir James took out the documents and unfolded them by the light of the lantern. "A deed to land in Normandy," he announced. 3 estates that had been inherited by the late Viscountess from her family. Under French law, they could not be confiscated to pay off English debts. "This is considerable property, Miss Wellingford. Even if you decide to sell them, the proceeds will be substantial." "And what about the banknotes?" Arthur asked. The lawyer counted them quickly with a practiced motion. "About £10,000, he replied. "Add to that the value of the jewelry and the land. Miss Wellingford, you are a wealthy woman." The late Viscount's debts amounted to around £5,000. "Once they have been paid off, you will have more than enough for a comfortable life." Grace raised her head and looked at Arthur through her tears. "I'm free," she whispered. "Finally free." Yes, he touched her forehead with his lips. You are free, and now no one can take that away from you. They were sitting in the basement, surrounded by treasures and centuries of dust. At that moment, the past finally let go of Grace. She was no longer a fugitive hiding in the shadows. She was the daughter of Viscount Wellingford, an heiress, a woman with a future. Next to her was the man who had helped her reclaim her identity. The court hearing took place a week later. By then, Sir James had prepared all the documents, described the contents of the chest, and had everything certified by a notary. The jewels and money had been placed in a bank for safekeeping, and the deeds to the French land had been placed in a safe deposit box. The courtroom was full. Thomas Wellingford sat with his lawyer, confident of victory. He did not know what had happened. He did not know that his plan had collapsed. Grace sat between Arthur and Lady Margaret. Margaret, wearing a strict, dark blue taffeta dress with a high collar and long sleeves. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant bun. Around her neck was a modest pearl necklace. She looked the part. A lady. The judge heard both sides. The lawyer for Grace's uncle spoke of debts, Grace's irresponsible disappearance, and Thomas Wellingford's right to guardianship as the closest relative. Then Sir James took the floor and calmly and methodically demolished all of the opposing sides' arguments. He presented the Viscount's will, a letter from the late Lord Craven agreeing to become guardian, an inventory of the chest's contents, and documents for the French land. He also presented calculations showing that the value of the inheritance was more than enough to pay off all debts. Miss Wellingford owes nothing to anyone, he concluded. Moreover, she is the owner of a considerable fortune. Mr. Thomas Wellingford, her closest relative, was supposed to take care of her, but instead he deceived her and forced her to flee and hide for 5 years in order to take possession of his late brother's property for himself. Thomas's face contorted with rage, but he remained silent. His lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The judge retired to deliberate, and the wait was agonizingly long. Arthur held Grace's hand, and she felt his warmth and strength. Finally, the judge returned. I rule, he boomed across the courtroom, that Miss Grace Elizabeth Wellingford is the sole legal heir of the late Viscount Wellingford. All property, including estates, jewelry, cash and land in France, shall pass into her full ownership. The debts of the late Viscount are to be paid from the estate within 3 months. Lord Arthur Craven's guardianship is recognized as legal until Grace reaches the age of 21 or marries, whichever comes first. Mr. Thomas Wellingford's claims are dismissed in their entirety. The gavel struck the Cumrose table loudly and decisively. Grace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Arthur embraced her, ignoring those present, and held her close. It's over, he whispered in her hair. Did you win? We won, she sobbed. Thomas Wellingford stood up, his face contorted with rage. He gave Grace a long, hateful look, then turned and left the room without saying a word. Grace watched him go, feeling nothing, no fear, no anger, and not even satisfaction, only relief. He no longer had power over her. He never would again. Lady Margaret sobbed, wiping her tears with a lace handkerchief. At last, justice had prevailed. Sir James approached them with a satisfied smile. Miss Wellingford, congratulations. You are now a free and wealthy woman. My services are at your disposal if you need help managing your estate. Thank you, Sir James. Grace shook his hand in gratitude. In the evening, when they returned to Craven House, Lady Margaret threw a small party with champagne, cake, and laughter. Her aunt made a toast to justice, perseverance, and love that conquers all obstacles. However, when everyone had retired for the night, Grace and Arthur were left alone in the drawing room. The candles were burning down, the fireplace crackled quietly, and silence hung in the air. Grace stood by the window, looking out at the nighttime garden. Arthur came up behind her, put his arms around her waist, and pulled her close. What are you thinking about? He asked quietly. The future? The fact that, for the first time in my life, it truly belongs to me. I can choose. She turned in his arms and looked into his face. I choose you, she said. Arthur smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed him. Then I have a question. He took a step back and dropped to one knee. Grace's heart beat so hard that she could barely breathe. Grace Elizabeth Wellingford, and he began. You brought me back to life. You taught me to feel again, to hope, to love. Now you are free from the past, free from debts, free from dependence of any kind. You can choose any life you want. He took a small box out of his pocket and opened it. Inside was a delicate ring, sparkling with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. But if you choose me and agree to share your life with me, he continued, his voice trembling, I promise to do everything I can to make sure you never regret it. His voice trembled. Grace, will you marry me? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled. She smiled so much that her cheeks hurt. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Arthur. 1,000 times yes. Yes, he slipped the ring onto her finger, stood up and pulled her towards him. Their kiss was long and deep, full of all the promises they had not yet spoken aloud. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. When? Grace asked, pressing her forehead against his chest. Whenever you want, he replied. Tomorrow, a year from now, we have all the time in the world. Then soon, she decided. I don't want to wait. I've waited too many years to start living. Arthur kissed her forehead and held her tighter. As you say, my love. They stood in each other's arms until the candles burned out and dawn broke outside the window. It was a day when anything was possible. 3 months later, Grace Wellingford married Lord Arthur Craven in a small church in Surrey, near the restored estate of her childhood. The ceremony was modest yet elegant. Close friends and servants from both households attended, as did Lady Margaret, who wept into her handkerchief throughout the service, though she insisted it was from joy. Grace wore a cream silk dress embroidered with pearls and a Brussels lace petticoat that had belonged to her mother. Around her neck was an emerald necklace found in a chest, and in her hair was a white rose from the restored garden. When the priest declared them husband and wife, and Arthur kissed her amid the ringing of bells, Grace felt something inside her finally heal. The fear was gone. The past had let go. Only love lay ahead. After the wedding, they returned to the Wellingford estate. It would now be their family home. In the 3 months since they had left, the house had been transformed, repaired, painted, and filled with light and life. Mrs. Collins, the elderly housekeeper, whom Grace had found and brought back, wiped away tears as she watched her ward dance with her husband in the refurbished living room. Who would have thought, whispered Lady Margaret, standing by the window, that it would all end this way? It's not the end, smiled the housekeeper. It's the beginning. Grace and Arthur danced, paying no attention to the guests. Music flowed from the open windows into the garden, where white roses were blooming again, and the air was sweet with their fragrance. Are you happy, Lady Craven? Arthur whispered in her ear. Grace tilted her head back and looked into his beloved, familiar face, the meaning of her new life. Happy, my lord, more than I could have dreamed. And it was true, pure, simple, and beautiful. She had been a servant who kept a family secret, but now the secret had been revealed, and with it came freedom. Freedom to be herself, freedom to love, freedom to live. That freedom was more precious than any treasure.